Welcome to the Probate Nation. My name is Richard Ruddy. Our show this evening is about identifying and locating who gets the money from an estate. You know, finding something lost is very rewarding. I consider the story of a dad who was late for work because he could not locate his car keys. Turns out his 2-year-old son had borrowed them to drive his cozy coupe car in the family room. Or there is the man who lost his wedding ring only to find it attached to a carrot he was growing in his garden. While those stories are touching and humorous, identifying and finding the heirs of an estate can be much more challenging. And if you make a mistake, there can be legal and financial consequences for you. To help educate us on how this search can be accomplished properly, we are pleased to have with us Rob Puglisi from the MMCA Group, with extensive experience in locating individuals worldwide, including Mrs. Heirs. Let me tell you a little bit about Rob. Rob is the owner and president of MMCA Group in Burke, Virginia. He has 40-plus years of investigative experience as a personal investigator and certified fraud examiner with a designation called CFE. This experience includes locating heirs in probate cases and providing testimony in federal, state, and local courts as both a fact and qualified expert witness. Please welcome Rob Puglisi from MMCA Group. Hi, Rob.
All right, Richard.
Good, thank you. Well, probably the probate of an estate typically, begins when someone has passed away and they have an estate which needs to be transferred to their beneficiaries. As we mentioned in the opening comments, beneficiaries may be spelled out in a will that has been admitted to probate, but if there is no will, those beneficiaries may be spelled out in state law called intestate successions. In which case the beneficiaries are called heirs at law. For our discussion today, we're going to call a whole group of people they're going to be called heirs. So sometimes it's easy to find these heirs and sometimes it's not. So let's start with, in the beginning, what are some of the records and information you look for in a search to find an heir?
Well, it starts with whatever the executor might have on hand from his examination of the decedent's, effects, and, things like wills or statements of the family history, even family Bibles. We check various court records as well once we had that information for death certificates and divorce records, maybe marriage records. And then it would proceed from there to the specific information we're looking for about particular lines of descendancy.
So where's the first place someone should look? I'm an executor, I get appointed. Where's the first place I should look to locate those records about any named or potential heirs?
Well, here in Virginia, you hit the Fairfax County or, Alexandria Circuit Court or the Arlington Circuit Court. The circuit courts are the repository of this kind of information. There are some times where a district court might have a record of a small claims litigation that might lead you to some additional information, but mostly it's in the circuit courts, and there's a probate division in each court.
Okay, so armed with this information, what resources are available to the public through an internet search to continue their sort of investigation?
Right, there's numerous nowadays databases is what it amounts to, but it's through the internet that collect information in genealogical sort of records. They would have things like I just described, official public records, and then they would also have things about that would be more pertinent to like a person researching his own genealogy. So you might find a chart somewhere that matches someone on your potential, on the decedent's line of descendancy, or that would give you a hint that somebody else might be looking or has looked and put together some sort of genealogical chart.
So often I know you in our discussion to prepare for this show, these public databases are typically or sometimes are often insufficient to solve the search. So are there other databases that you as a professional turn to dig deeper?
Right. So, once armed with some information, we as investigators, licensed investigators, would have access to some consumer type information, other potential court records that maybe the public wouldn't have. And from there, we can hone in on, particular targets in any kind of an estate. you're not always getting very unique names. You could have very common names and only a very broad date range of when the person was born. So you have to try to find what we call identifying information or identifiers, date of birth, place of birth, that kind of thing, parents. And there are some databases that we would have access to that the general public just wouldn't.
And are any problems or limitations, with these databases, even the ones you have access to as a professional?
There are, and like I said, the more common the name, the more difficult the filtering process is to find the relevant information. We call the non-relevant information noise hits. So if we were looking for someone named Mary Smith, you can imagine, even if we had a general area where we were looking, we might have a lot of Mary Smith identifying information that could be end up noise. So the investigator or the genealogical researcher would have to use other information that was available to him from the executor or from the examination of the effects or some other source to hone in on that we're looking for the right party. And those databases that you can access don't do that. You need an analysis of their results.
Okay. Now, I know that sort of moving to the international, a lot of people have, moved here, immigrated here from overseas and other countries, and maybe were a couple generations down there. So, talk a little bit about the special challenges you might have where you've got to find people who have family that are overseas, and they don't have a lot of data here.
Yeah, that really varies with the location, and I've had a lot of cases where they've emanated from the Northern Virginia area, from the probate courts here, but they reach back to the former Soviet Union, for instance. All of those countries that were under the Iron Curtain for so many years are a difficult landscape to maneuver, and you have to kind of have a good feel about international kind of politics even, and the way the systems work then and the way the systems work now. Other parts of Europe have England, for example, has a very extensive genealogical subset, and you can go and do a search in England pretty much as you would do here. But then there's some other countries, outside of Europe that provide specific challenges, and you really would need somebody on the ground local to help you maneuver through that.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about, that goes to the local knowledge, which I think we talked about, where someone locally may actually know where to look, for a particular thing. And tell us a little bit about that, if you could, or some of your experiences there.
Right. So just as here, there will be people with backgrounds such as mine, or in the case of the the former Soviet Union states, they would have probably been intelligence officers. So back then, in the 1940s through up to 1994, there would be a wealth of information that had been concealed from the public that someone in that capacity would know how to pursue. And really, the best thing they can provide on the ground is to verify the authenticity of anything that comes up presented either by a potential heir or counsel for a potential heir that might say that a record is what it is, when we know from a local former intelligence officer, that those were falsified records or easily doctored records.
Huh. Oh, that's interesting. Well, the entire, once we collect all this information from these various resources, sometimes we have to go far and wide to go get stuff. But, we in an estate, with the information that we put to the probate court needs to be accurate, so it requires proof. So talk a little bit about the challenges to prove and test your conclusions when you get all the information collected and get it in front of you.
Right, and that's sort of the difference between a person doing his own, genealogy hunt, and then a professional investigator who's going to be tasked to have to testify about why his evidence, and that's what we call it, is evidence if you're presenting it in court, is authentic. So we would have to present, first of all, a visual representation of what we did. And the visual representation in a chart format is usually very helpful to a judge or to, you know, guardian ad litem who might be presiding in the case, to give them the overview. And then at each step and each person on that chart, we would retrieve as best we can the best evidence, say a birth certificate, a certified document from a vital statistics that says a person was born at a certain time, and a death certificate, or a marriage record, or a divorce record, or even other court records that prove that somebody was in fact or wasn't, you know, part of a lineage. So at each point on our chart that we would provide, there would be a corresponding annotation that says see document A, see document B, and those would be certified documents from the custodian of records, that the relevant custodian of records, you know, for each search.
What's interesting, you should mention about the chart, I would pass along to the viewers that that Rob and I had never met until we actually had this show. We talked on the phone, but Rob prepared for me maybe 20 years ago one of those charts that was, you know, in a big, I'm not even sure how big the paper was, but it was humongous. And we had to submit it to the court, you know, so they could figure out and confirm who we were supposed to give the money to. So, but again, every step, every person on that thing was supported by some sort of a documentation. Now, how often do people have to go to court and have the expert testify about these results?
Well, that kind of varies too. You know, there's various reasons for that to happen. One could be a really hotly contested heir search where people who are in the line of succession on one side are challenging potential heirs on another side. And for that reason, the investigator presenting the evidence would have to document every specific step so that the judge can make a decision that there's authenticity to the claim of being an heir. There are other situations where, in intestate cases especially, where nobody has been identified at the outset of when the person dies as being a relative, but as we say all the time, everyone has somebody, and there's always a history behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So when you bring forth that record, you're going to have to document it and present it, especially if there are, you know, one or two people that were clearly identified, and then you bring forth other people that were unknown. That becomes a point of contention for any judge to say, you know, we need to make sure this is accurate. And then the last way is when you've taken every potential vigilant attempt to find information and you just can't get to the end result of finding an error. Yeah, I've had to testify in front of court that, yes, I made a diligent effort and here are my steps. And therefore, under whatever the value is of the estate, you know, we made a diligent effort. And then from there, the judge either assigns it to the Commonwealth's, you know, Treasury.
Sure.
Or comes up with another solution, but that has to be demonstrated in court.
Well, we don't like to see what they call a sheet to the Commonwealth, but let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about the heir search industry real quickly, and then, you know, tell us a little. That seems to be that industry is growing. Of course, we got all these people getting older, so people are dying. So we got a lot of estates that are being processed. So, tell me a little bit about. I gather there's an association that represents this industry. Tell us a little bit about the types of firms that are actively involved in the industry, though.
So there are people who are, their whole job is to search for missing heirs, and you know they're referred to various ways in the industry. They're percentage fee firms, things like that, and they go about hunting the public records for clients. So they have some sort of formula that says certain areas, zip codes, whatever, are going to be, you know, have estates that will be of some value. And if they find there's a record of a probate filed, they will go on their own, search these records that we talked about, and try to find out some heirs. They will then approach these people who might not have any clue that they're part of any, you know, genealogy search or connected to any decedent with money. And these percentage fee companies will approach that person, that potential heir, and pitch them, um, a proposition is they will, for a particular fee, which sometimes can be, a third of whatever the inheritance is, they will then disclose where the estate is and how that their client is connected to it.
Okay. Well, and in the industry itself, there's a lot of different people that do heir searches. Like, some people do it hourly. Some people just,
Right.
there's people that do it kind of as a hobby and so on. What you're talking about is really kind of leads to that unsolicited letter of inheritance that you get where someone reaches out to you. As a fiduciary, I can certainly tell you I've received those letters, where I say someone has passed away and they're entitled to this or that. Or in some cases, though, these firms actually are reaching out to say, hey, you're the executor of the estate. They apparently have been tasked by ABC, brokerage house or company to find somebody because they want to get something turned over. And so then that's how they get paid. So there's kind of a little different angle that come there. But I would say this is that, does the the fee that's to be charged there, is that something that can be negotiated?
It can be. Now, the more aware the party is who's being approached, of course, the better deal they're going to make. Now, some people, it comes out of the blue and they're not, involved in the legal or judicial system, so they'll have no idea. But most of the time, if someone were to approach you like that, and you had an idea that you had a long lost relative someplace, you could go to those public record sources that we talked about, check the probate records just like the heir search firm did, and see if it's a relative that you can connect to. And then you would avoid that fee. But that's the value of those companies, is that they tell you something you wouldn't otherwise have discovered.
And I would tell you that I'll share this story. I actually had a client contact, the son of a client contacted me. It turns out that the probate that she had done, turned out that some asset was not disclosed to her, and so there was some additional money that was due to her. And the son, local medical provider, said, what do we do? And I said, well, they wanted to charge I think a third. And I said, well, more than likely, he said, it probably is sitting down in the Virginia unclaimed property. And what you just need to do is just take a look online and you can figure that out, and you might be able to save yourself some time. Well, they asked me to help them out, but it turned out that there was like $30,000 or $35,000 down there, and they wanted a third in order to tell them that it was there. So, so check the unclaimed property, wherever you happen to be. That often is a place you can find out pretty quickly that whether you have some money due. Tell me this: when should a professional be hired, though?
Well, if you're the executor or the administrator, it depends on the situation. But if you're confronted with one of these cases, and I've had a few of these here recently where someone lived a very long life, but became like a recluse and didn't have a full mental capacity. Once that person, if there had been a conservator, in that situation, that person is the one who should have potentially looked into it beforehand. But once that happens and you're named executive or administrator of that type of a situation, that's when you need to find somebody, because there's a lot of other tasks that person has to take on. Hunting for unknown heirs is probably not one they really want to, wade into, and it's something that's required.
Sure. Now let's talk about just share a couple of stories here. I know when we were preparing for this show, tell me about some of the common problems that you've encountered in doing heir searches. And I know we had this story about people not being truthful. Would you share that just without
right?
Any...
And that situation has occurred in however many years I've been doing this. It hasn't occurred very often, but when it does, it's pretty stark and it's comical in some situations. So we had a matter and I don't remember where it emanated from, but so it was a fairly good size intestate estate. And we, you know, poured out and found branches of a potential, third cousins once removed. And both of these parties lived in New York City. One lived in Brooklyn and one, I think, lived in the Bronx. And we found out that they were brothers, but I couldn't get a hold of one of them. And, I had another guy in my office. He was working one side. So we both independently made contact with our brother. And I then, because I was the task officer on this, I had to then confirm everything and get information from each brother. So one brother was a fireman in the city, and the other guy, I forgot what he did. But when I called the second non-fireman brother, I asked him, the particular question, who he's related to, if he has any living siblings, and he told me no. And I said, "Are you sure about that?" He said, "No, I don't have any." So I then had to go back and confirm to the fireman. And when I encountered the fireman, he said, "That's just like my brother." So the return where I have to get the documentation from them, I talked to the non-fireman brother and mentioned that, he shouldn't lie to me. I'm trying to help him. And he basically said, "Well, I gave it a shot." He was trying to manipulate the genealogy so he could get a bigger share, is what it amounted to.
That's good. I found that very humorous. And the other one that you mentioned, which I actually experienced in an estate that I was handling, is where I was ministering in a estate, and as I was talking, I had a report from a search firm, and as I was talking to verify various people among the ones I had, I asked one of the siblings, said, "Well, I have another sister." And I said, "Well, she's not on my chart that I was given to me." He said, "Oh yeah." So we searched high and low. Well, eventually we located this person, but it's interesting because you mentioned something about where people back in the 50s and so on, they might ask somebody else to raise their kid for some reason.
Right.
And we actually had a situation where, somebody actually took a child and raised it, never adopted it. But so when it came time on an intestate, that child and then that child's child all were able to inherit. But you wouldn't know that unless you had asked some questions within the family, and we finally said, "Well, who is this person? I can't find it."
That's right. And that's kind of the value of being an investigator. We're skilled and trained in how to interview people, interview witnesses, find out if we're getting the whole story and not. And that kind of insight is valuable in those kind of cases. I've had several of those too here recently, where they swore they called the person's sister, but technically the child had been placed in like a neighbor, a very close neighbor. They weren't even a relative, and they were never adopted.
Right.
So the law is looking at that one way, whereas the family and everybody else probably look at it another way. But, unfortunately,
Yeah.
the law is what says what it says.
Sure. Well, look, we're winding down our time. Wanted to get some, for someone who's spent a lifetime with assets, accumulating their assets, you want to make sure that they get it to the right people. Tell me some closing comments, suggestions you have for folks to maybe avoid having the need for a search firm to get involved in their estate.
Yeah, it's really important, and I don't. It's just important in everybody's life to keep a record of how they're connected to their preceding generations, so that the following generations will know something. And especially in situations that an administrator or an executor has to take over, that's invaluable. So, if you can make a list of, when you make out a will, whatever the date certain on that will might be, you could make a little side chart that says, "This is my genealogy at the time. These are the people where they live." It gives people a starting place at some point. It may be 20 years later that this happens, that you have to have an air search done, but you'll at least have a starting point. That's very important. And then other than that, to try to keep records that would indicate where you came from, especially when we talked about those overseas people. I've had cases where the World War II, they were called displaced persons. They had no country because the landscape changed once the Nazis took over and the war ended. They had some link to somebody and they kept a record of it. If they didn't have much possessions, but they would keep something that would give you a tie to say, right, I need to go to Romania or the Romanian community in New York City to give me maybe some help here. Those things are important. And, for the executor to look for those things, after the decedent has passed away is important too, because they might overlook things. I've had administrators go through things and, I give them a suggestion. Why don't you look in a family Bible? Because they sometimes will keep documents in there too. And lo and behold, they literally found a birth certificate that I could not find anywhere.
Very interesting. Well, Rob, look, it's been a blast to catch up with you and actually see you in person. I want to thank you so much for this really valuable information and insights. All your experience is very, very helpful for folks, both to maybe plan ahead to avoid these problems, and otherwise to have a pathway to get problems solved if they haven't done so. So I want to thank you for this great public service.
That was my pleasure. Thanks.
You're very, very welcome. Before you embark on your probate journey, you need to determine who gets the money. Hopefully you will have a good list of names and contact information and details about the beneficiaries named in the will, or a list of the heirs at law if there is no will. We urge clients to compose and update regularly such a list, whether they have a will or not. But if you have an incomplete or out-of-date list, we encourage you to hire a professional investigator to figure all of that out. Their written report, supporting documents, and availability to testify about their findings will be critical in protecting you when distributions are made to those who should rightfully get the inheritance due to them. This brings us to the conclusion of our show. I hope you found it helpful. Until next time, good luck on your probate journey.